Chapter 2, Part 1, Moral Relativism. So the objectives for this video, we're going to consider some of the consequences of ethical relativism by looking at a story, and then we're going to have the opportunity to try to respond to some of these consequences. So we're going to begin with a story about Dave and Alison. "No, madame, may not drive this way," explained the officer, who with the nicest smile had just waved them to a stop. Alison looked at her husband Dave, sitting beside her in the car, who just shrugged. They'd recently arrived in this town for the next big leg of their tour of the world's more exotic spots. "But you just let another car go by just a minute before," Alison said, turning back to the policeman. "Don't much speak English," the policeman said, "but cannot drive this road." Dave and Alison stared at the man, who was smiling still more broadly than before. "I cannot let drive. I sometimes only let officials." Dave continued staring for a moment, and suddenly gave Alison a knowing look. Pulling out his passport, he placed a 5-pound note on top. "Oh, then, it's okay," he said to the officer. "We're visiting officials. Here, see my papers." Reaching in front of Alison and over the window, he carelessly dropped the money out the window while holding open his passport. The policeman swiftly caught the fluttering money, pocketed it, and glanced for a moment at the passport. Then, still smiling, he stepped back and waved. "Good, madame. You are official. You have right this way," he said, not giving them a further glance. Alison drove a mile and then shot a curious look at her husband. "When in Rome, do as the Romans do," he said, forcing a little laugh. "And just how much do you think we should act like the Romans anyhow?" Alison retorted. "Live and let live," Dave muttered. "Let's just forget about it." "But I don't like that sort of thing, and I hate to waste the money," Alison said, more heatedly than she intended. As an afterthought, she added, "You know, Dave, men in this culture may have several wives. I wouldn't be surprised if that policeman has a couple, and I didn't care for the way he looked at me. I hope you wouldn't tell me that polygamy's okay, too." Trying to laugh it off, Dave commented, "Well, my dear, it has its attractions." "That," Alison spit out as she floored the accelerator, "is not funny." All right. So now I'm going to summarize the story so that we all understand what happened. Dave and Alison were vacationing in some far-off place with a culture that's very different than their own. Their car was stopped by an officer who wouldn't let them pass. Dave realized that bribery is practiced in this culture, and so bribed the officer with a 5-pound note. So the officer let Dave and Alison pass. After they drove off, Alison expressed to Dave that she didn't think that it was okay to bribe the officer, and Dave responded by saying, "When in Rome," meaning that it's necessary to follow the customs of the society that you're in. Alison responded to this by pointing out that it was a custom of the society that they were in to practice polygamy, which is the practice of having more than one wife. Dave couldn't possibly accept polygamy, so why should he accept bribery? The story ends with a joke. In response to Alison pointing out the tension of accepting bribery, but not wanting to accept polygamy, Dave said, "Well, my dear, polygamy has its attractions." Right. And to this, Alison said, "That's not funny." So I've spoiled the joke, but such as it is. All right, now the point. What's going on in this story? The story's trying to draw out attention in the view that different societies can have different and independent moral systems. If we're willing to say that something like bribery is okay in a particular culture because it's accepted there, even when it's not accepted in our culture, are we also willing to say the same thing about polygamy? And I'll just point out here that polygamy is the practice of having more than one wife, And this is different, importantly different than something that's related, which is polyamory. Polyamory is the custom of having more than one sexual partner. So notice that this is about polygamy, the practice of having more than one wife. So if we're willing to say that both bribery and polygamy are okay depending on the culture, right, even if these things are not accepted in our culture, is there anything that wouldn't be okay? So for example, if it was accepted in a culture to murder people, would this be okay? If we were in that culture, would it be okay to murder people? So, although the idea that different societies have different and independent moral systems immediately appeals to a lot of people, we're not always ready to accept all of the consequences of this view. And in fact, in this chapter, we're going to have a lot of opportunities to kind of dig into some of these consequences. All right, now I'm going to leave you with a couple of questions. So first, even if this officer's society accepts bribery, suppose that Dave's doesn't. Does this make it morally right or wrong for Dave to bribe the officer? And why or why not? Now pay special attention to the why or why not. That's the important part of this question. The second question, which is morally better, monogamy or polygamy? Monogamy is the practice of having only one wife or husband, whereas polygamy is the practice of having multiple wives. Is this just your society's view? Or can you provide reasons for your position?